Good afternoon. We are going to get started since it's just about noon and we are starting the recording, so we'll have an archive of this webinar on the Adult Redeploy Illinois website. Welcome to today's webinar, which is intended to orient new sites and refresh the knowledge of continuing sites on the topics of importance in Adult Redeploy Illinois. ARI is a state-funded grant initiative that incentivizes local jurisdictions to divert nonviolent offenders from prison into more cost-effective, evidence-based community corrections programs. This webinar today will focus on the grants process and reporting. So today's webinar is presented by myself, Lindsay LaPointe. I'm the program manager for Adult Redeploy Illinois, and Cindy Pence, who is the grant monitor for Adult Redeploy Illinois. So you'll hear both of us speak on our areas of expertise. So today we have a small group of either new ARI sites or people that are in new roles at ARI sites. The webinar shouldn't take the full hour, and we'll certainly have time for questions at the end, but you can also type in questions by the chat function throughout the webinar, and if it makes sense, we'll address them as they arise. Again, we'll make sure to archive the webinar on the ARI website soon, and I'll send an email to all of you when it's up. So the purpose of this training, it's to acquaint new ARI implementation grantees with the grant process, the grant paperwork, and the timelines for those things. The goal is really to make things easier for everybody, including us and you, in the near and short term, so grantees know what to expect. You can learn about the process and the paperwork, why the process exists, and you can get an understanding of how long things can take at times. We want to teach about the fiscal reporting and fund disbursement process. So we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of fiscal reporting and fund disbursement before the reports are due. We're going to also talk about quarterly data reporting. So we'll learn about that and how it's different from the quarterly data pull and the ARI database, which is something that Rebecca Skorick and Marianne Dyer will talk about tomorrow in the second webinar in this series. So the suggested audience for this webinar is site-level staff responsible for grant paperwork, fiscal reporting, and data reporting. And whoever's responsible for this stuff really varies according to site. That's locally determined. Sometimes it's a coordinator that's literally paid under the grant, and sometimes it's the director of probation who is using some of their time to be responsible for these duties. So it's really a breadth of people that we're speaking to today. So some general information about the grant process and reporting to start us off. Adult Redeploy Illinois funds are state funds administered by the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, where federal standards apply to all grants regardless of the funding source. So the ARI program is housed at what we refer to as CJA. ARI now runs on state general revenue funds, but the federal standards still apply because those standards apply to all grants administered by CJA. The grant agreement process is rigorous and it often requires negotiation. This is really just the normal process of things. And we had a former lawyer here at CJA who said something really helpful for me to hear in a training, and he said he had been here several years, and he said at no point did a grant go through legal review with no questions or no need for edits. So we're always going to ask you to make edits or ask you questions to explain stuff, and that's very typical and is not abnormal. ARI funds do not require match funds. Allowability of costs is a matter of reasonableness and necessity for the administration of the program. So that right there is the lens that the legal department here uses for their review of the grant paperwork. ARI funds cannot be used for food and beverage costs. This is a federal restriction, and since we use the federal guidelines, it's a restriction that applies to ARI grants. There are a few exceptions to this that relate to children, and it relates to offering food and beverages in extremely remote locations, but we don't expect those to arise. So in general, food and beverage is not allowed with ARI grants. The ARI implementation grant periods are generally for 12 months. However, grants for 6 or 9 months can be granted. And as you all know, right now we're in that strange time where we have some grant programs that are going to get started for 6 months. So that's a less than a 12-month period. Sometimes that's just how it happens, because we want to do our best to help get these programs off the ground.
Hi everyone, this is Cindy Pent. I am one of the grant monitors for Adult Redeploy, and I'm going to first start talking about the grant process. Most of you are familiar with this since we are currently mid-grant agreement processing, but it's always a good idea to refresh our memories on the process, especially since before you know it, you will be reapplying for next year's program. The first step in the grant process is that your county would have received a letter of approval from the Adult Redeploy Oversight Board. That letter would have included the maximum amount of award for your program. As a side note, when you are returning your budget, that budget only needs to be less than the amount that is awarded in the letter. It does not need to be exact, so you do not need to have your budget to the penny for that award amount. It can be quite difficult to do that, in fact. The grant materials are all submitted to ICEJA. I receive them and I review each thing very carefully. Everything that you are returning was provided to you. So you are returning the cover page, Exhibit A, which is the lengthy program narrative, Exhibit B, which is your budget, the subcontractor chart, your audit information sheet, and your fiscal information sheet. After I receive the materials, like I said, I go through each item very carefully, and that would be the first time that I would be in contact with you and the county. I would be talking to you about what different documents are missing, what changes need to be taken to either the Exhibit A, the narrative, or Exhibit B, the budget. I'm going to try to review everything so that I catch as much as I can before it goes on to the next step of review here at ICEJA, which is the fiscal review. Once I find all the materials to be ready, I will then forward them on to the fiscal department, and what they're mainly looking at are the fiscal information documents to make sure certain registrations are up to date, and also to make sure that your budget calculations are correct. They're going to make sure that your budget crosses and foots. Once they review it, if they have any items that need changes, they'll then return it to me, and I will then contact you, work together, make the changes, and if necessary, return it to the fiscal department to receive their approval. Once their approved budget comes back to me, we then send it to the ICEJA legal department. The legal department will then be reviewing it. They will also be checking calculations. However, they are more so interested in the narrative and the explanation of your program. During this whole process, I will be working with you very closely, going back and forth, assisting you with any changes so that we can expedite this process as much as possible. Like Lindsay mentioned, it's almost impossible to get through this whole process without having to do any edits or any changes. but it's in everyone's best interest that there's so many different layers of oversight for these agreements. So once you have finally gotten the approval from our fiscal departments and our legal departments, you will then receive the grant agreement for your county signatures. And this is pretty much where everyone is currently. In the mail, you will receive the entire packet, which will include the grant agreement, the cover page, the Exhibit A, Exhibit B, all the fiscal information, and the initial cash request. Once you receive this entire packet, your county is responsible to get all the different documentations signed by the appropriate parties. For the most part, each form states exactly who needs to sign based on the cover page that you had turned in at the very beginning. Make sure to sign and date where appropriate, and you will need to return the original signed documents back to ICEJA. We actually need to receive the originals of the agreement and not a PDF or a fax of these documents. As I mentioned, the one form that will be new when you receive your grant agreement packet will be the initial cash request. This initial cash request form will need to be signed by the authorized program official, and this is actually the first time that you can ever request funds from this program. This is the first chance you have to either recoup any expenses that you've already incurred since the first day of your performance period, or if you're anticipating equipment purchases right in the beginning of the grant that you would need funds right away for, this would be the time that you would make this request. Some counties or sites choose not to request funds up front. They would rather operate on a reimbursement only situation. So that's really up to each site individually. When you receive your grant agreement packet, the other two items that will be in there will be the audit information sheet, which you've already completed at the time of the application, as well as the fiscal information sheet, which was also previously completed. Once you have everything signed, like I said, you will return it back to ICEJA. At that point, it will be reviewed by us to make sure all the appropriate documentation is there. And it'll actually go to our executive director for his signature. Once it is signed by our ICEJA executive director, at that time the grant monitor, myself, will actually provide to you a copy of the executed agreement, the data report templates, and the fiscal report templates. This will be your formal notification that the grant agreement has been executed. It is imperative that you maintain this documentation on site and be sure that you have it available, for in the future as well. Okay. During the actual program period, at some point you might find that there's been a change in the program, or that you've had a new expense that maybe you didn't think of while you were actually writing the budget and the narrative. Or in some cases you might have expected an expense that you no longer see the need for. You might, so at this point you would actually need to contact your grant monitor, and they can actually assist you as to whether your change that you're foreseeing would be a budget revision or a budget amendment. And I'm going to actually explain the difference. A budget amendment is a much more lengthier process. It actually involves changes to the program model, new elements, or changes to a grant designation. An amendment is actually going to restart the review process to where it would go through the monitor, the fiscal department, and the legal department. So like I said, that's going to be a much lengthier process. A budget revision, on the other hand, is when you would think of a new expense that you would need to add to your budget, or something that you anticipated spending but you had spent less and you wanted to move the funds to a different area. This would take place between already approved categories. So for example, if you find that within your commodities budget you had set aside $500 for books, and then you found out that the books are only going to cost you $300, you're going to have a surplus of $200. However, your expenses for office supplies were higher than you anticipated. You would be able to submit a budget revision to move that dollar amount to another category. This process is actually a much simpler process because it just comes to the grant monitor and does not have to go through the entire ICEJA legal and fiscal team. Both budget revisions and amendments must occur 60 days prior to the end of the grant period. In this current grant period, that would be before May 1st. It is also important to note that budget revisions cannot be retroactive. What this means is, once you submit a budget revision, that change in the budget will only be allowed from that day of request forward. You cannot make a budget revision that would start in the beginning of the grant period and make changes from then. It would only be from the date of your request forward. Once approved, all budget changes are to be reflected on subsequent fiscal reports. So once you submit the budget revision, your grant monitor will inform you that you have received approval for the change, and it will be your responsibility to go to your fiscal template and update the changes for the next month that would be due. So for example, if you sent in a budget revision this month and it was approved, your following fiscal report, which would be due March 5th, would then reflect the new budget. Now I'm going to go into the specifics for a budget revision request. And like I said, as soon as you see the need for a budget revision, you should contact your grant monitor, and they will be able to provide you with all the documentation you need. There's 4 different parts to a budget revision. There is the first part, which is a letter on an agency letterhead. The second part, a budget revision request form. The third is the current budget marked with the requested revisions. And the fourth and final is the clean budget that incorporates requested revisions. The letter on agency letterhead is actually the request in writing for the change in your budget. The overall purpose of the budget form and the letter is to actually express to your monitor and this agency how the revision will support or enhance the program. You actually need to detail exactly what you want to revise and why. You must wait for written approval prior to expending funds under the new budget. Just in general, some of the criteria to let you know what I'm considering when reviewing your budget revision. The first thing is to make sure that it was submitted within the required timeline. Like I said, it needs to be submitted 60 days prior to the end of your grant agreement. I'm also looking to see, are the budget changes necessary? How will the funds be used? How will the revisions enhance the program? Is the request reasonable for the program? And also, if it includes purchase of items or equipment or supplies per se, is it reasonable given the remaining life of the grant? For example, it's hard to find, if you only have 1 month left of your grant period, it's hard to justify the need for buying a lot of supplies at the very end of your grant. Okay, On this slide, we actually have the actual budget revision request form. This request form is actually a fillable field form. The first page is basically your basic information, and it also asks for you to detail what change you're requesting and how it will impact the program. This form is imperative that you include all the items that are changing. So if your budget revision is actually increasing or decreasing an item, every single item needs to be included on this revision form. It actually narrates and explains all the changes. The most important thing, and what is most often forgotten about when I read these forms, are people do not include why they are needing to increase an amount. It's very important that you explain how this will benefit the program. But not only do you need to explain why you are increasing something, you also need to explain how you're able to decrease another amount or line item without having a negative impact on the program. This form should be looked at as a standalone document, meaning you don't need to have any additional items or budget narratives or budget matrices to be able to understand the revision. I should be able to take this form and this form alone and understand what you're needing to change and have all the calculations included on one page. So therefore, for each category, you have to list whether you're increasing or decreasing the line item and why. So for example, if you are stating that you're going to increase your travel expenses by $200, within that section you would notate that you're increasing travel and that you would have to state why you're increasing the travel and then provide the calculation. So in this example, if you were to increase travel by $200, you'd state $200 travel or $200 increase in travel budget to provide 10 additional cab fares. Cab fare of $20 times 10 participants equals $200. And then you would state why you would need the cab fare increase. For example, participants having a difficult time attending counseling without assistance. On the very last page of this budget request form, you need to actually be sure that you as the preparer are signing the page and that you're completing the matrix on the third page that shows the increase or decrease in each certain category. Another item that is requested or required, I should say, with the budget revision is a marked up budget. The marked up budget is exactly as it sounds. It is a handwritten, crossed out original budget that's going to easily show the changes that you're making in the revision. In some cases, it might be easier for you to do this in Excel if you prefer, if you're very Excel savvy. However, it is preferred if you can just actually write onto your original budget, cross out the numbers, cross out the budget narratives, and make it reflect what you're actually requesting in this revision. For the marked up budget, you must submit the entire budget, all categories, even if you're not making a change. And also on this marked up budget, you must provide justifications just as you did in the original agreement. You need to update the figures and the amounts and also check each of the calculations. In addition to the letter, the budget revision request form, the marked up budget, the final piece of the budget revision is a clean budget in an Excel file. This budget is actually the final budget that you're requesting that incorporates all the changes, and that will be the final approved budget revision budget. While your budget revision is under review, your grant monitor is going to be working closely with you, making sure that all the calculations are correct, that you have all the proper justification, and you'll be going back and forth, possibly making changes as we go along. Once everything is approved, I myself will forward that to my manager for her approval, and at that time, once everything is approved by ICEJA, you will be formally notified of the budget revision approval. This is going to come in the way of a formal letter, a copy of the approved budget revision form, and the new budget. At that time, once you receive the budget revision approval, it is then each county or site's responsibility to update your monthly fiscal template form to show your new budget. We'll actually be going over the monthly fiscal template in a couple of slides.
All right, this is Lindsay again, and before I get into this next slide, we got a few questions on if this PowerPoint will be available, and yes, absolutely. I can email it to everyone participating in this webinar this afternoon, and then in addition to that, the PowerPoint and a recording of this webinar will go up on the ARI website in the near future. So we're going to talk a little bit about renewal grants because we've learned that it's always helpful to know what's coming in the near future. And renewal grants, now that we are on a state general revenue fund schedule, preparation for renewal grants occurs in the spring. So spring is quite a busy time for the Adult Redeploy Illinois program. So first of all, renewal grants are contingent on state appropriation levels. In general, it's difficult to know what the appropriation level is until the state budget is signed, sealed, and delivered, and yet we have to plan for the renewal grants. It's just imperative that we do so. Historically, Adult Redeploy Illinois has had funds to maintain the ARI program or even grow it. Last year's budget was maintained, so the sites did have to reduce their budgets. If the budget allowed and a site, as they continue, wanted to grow, they might do so by enhancing specific services, or they might do so by increasing the number of people that they serve within their program. So in late April or early May, ARI grantees are invited to submit materials for a renewal grant, and they use something called a designation request form, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. But first, I think I should just note that there's no obligation to continue being an ARI grant or running an ARI program at the end of a grant period. That's something that's always locally determined. So getting back to the late April, early May period, which is a busy time for ARI, some things that are going on at that time, we have an Adult Redeploy Illinois All Sites Summit, which happens around late March or late April, and that event tends to be helpful for sites as they consider what to enhance within their program or what to tweak within their program in a renewal grant. Around this time of year, ARI staff is always available to consult with ARI sites that are planning to continue and to tweak some things with their program. We are always here to connect ARI sites to other ARI sites around the state, so you can learn what's worked well for them, what's been recently enhanced in other programs, what are some things that might need to be eliminated from programs or reduced. And if you haven't been to an ARI All Sites Summit yet, we hope you can come this year. It'll be on March 19th, and you'll see that there's a lot of discussions that take place about how to enhance programs, how to tweak programs, and how to run them in the most effective way. So to get back to the what we call the designation request form, which is the initial tool that sites use to apply for renewal funding. That's a document that is much simpler than a full response to a request for proposals. The form highlights additions to the program in the coming year, possible eliminations to the program. It highlights evidence-based practices, and it has broad budget categories on it, but it doesn't require you to input the detail of a budget in terms of the line item. So you might basically, you would have a total, the expected total for the contractual budget category in the next year, but you don't have to provide all the detail within that. So when the designation request form is complete, it's submitted to ARI staff, and the ARI Oversight Board reviews those designation request forms, and upon review, what they're focusing on is the use of evidence-based practices and how cost-effective the program is. If approved by the ARI Oversight Board, the normal CJA review of the grant will occur, and that goes back to what Cindy was talking about before, where she would then, or we would then request your budget for the following year and your Exhibit A for the following year. The subsequent grant periods begin July 1st and they run through June 30th. This is if everything goes as planned and there are state appropriations to run the program. Continuing program components can proceed as of July 1st without any interruption. New program components cannot begin until approval of the grant materials. So I want to provide an example of this. It's nobody's intention to interrupt programming that's ongoing. So for everything in an ARI program that is going to stay the same from one grant period to another, it's already been approved in the preceding grant period, programs can continue even if, let's say, even if the new budget for state fiscal year 16 isn't 100% approved here at CJA. However, if you plan to introduce a new component to your program, let's just say it's a new contractual mental health provider, that new program component couldn't start until the whole grant is approved here at CJA. And it's possible that the new grant for state fiscal year 16, let's just say it might not be approved until July 20th of 2015. So what that means is ARI funds cannot pay for that new contractual mental health provider until July 20th, the date that the grant has been approved here at CJA. We realize these things can get a little complicated, so we are, as you've probably all learned, we are very open to questions, or you can call us on the phone and we can walk you through things.
Okay, one of the requirements of this grant is that you report to us about your spending. We refer to this as your fiscal report, which is on a monthly schedule. It is the responsibility of each site to turn in your fiscal report by the 5th of each following month. And this report, which I have an example of the form on the next slide, will be provided to you alongside your executed grant agreement once you receive that. This form requires 2 signatures from your site, which one is the preparer of this document, and then the second is another individual who will approve it at your site. This form does not need to be the original signed form that I receive. You can actually PDF this, fax it, or if you choose, you can mail it to me. But it's preferred that you PDF it. It's a little quicker. And it's easier that way too if there's any corrections that need to be done. The back and forth is much more limited with PDFs. Let's see. So like I said, each fiscal report is due the 5th of each month. You will also have a final closeout fiscal report. So since this grant period, for example, ends June 30th, your June fiscal report would be due July 5th, and the closeout fiscal report would be due July 23rd is our final fiscal closeout date. The July 23rd report will actually cover any expenses that were incurred post last period of your date of the performance period of your grant. For example, any kind of bills that come in following the last day of the performance period that are still attributable to this grant. So for example, if you have an electric bill, say you have rent or electric charges in your grant agreement and that bill does not come in until July 15th, you're still able to report that to this grant period on that final fiscal closeout. But like I said, this fiscal report template will actually be provided to you with your executed grant agreement. One other thing to mention at the closeout report, there is a rule that we call the 10% rule. This is the only time that you may make changes to your budget without having prior approval. The 10% rule means that at closeout, you can have an increase of no more than 10% in individual line items within your budget. For example, in commodities, say you overspent by 9% in a certain line item. So under commodities, you would have to go over 9% in the line for books. That would be allowable for the 10% rule. And like I said, this is only allowed at closeout, and this is kind of a very tricky rule for fiscal reports. So this is going to be a great time for you to work closely with your monitor to see if of the allowability of certain changes. Also during the year, you might find that a mistake occurred or a possible omission from your fiscal report that you turned in for the month. The best thing to do is contact your monitor immediately to let them know that you're going to have a revised fiscal report. And what you would need to do is simply resubmit that month's fiscal report, notate somewhere on the top, either you can type it in or handwrite it in, notate that it was revised, and resubmit the form to your monitor, and they will have to reapprove this. So on this form, or on this slide, you can actually see the monthly fiscal report template that you will be receiving soon. At the very top, the first couple of boxes are actually the general information. It includes site name, program title, your performance period. All of these pieces of information will be required of you to complete correctly. In addition, the first column on the left-hand side, project budget, column 1, you will also need to populate this column according to the approved budget that you received in your grant agreement. This is also the same column that you will have to update if you provide a budget revision and the budget revision is approved. You would have to update this column to reflect your new budget amount. As you can see to the far right, I have two arrows. The first arrow is pointing to column 6, which is the projected expenses for the next 90 days. And the second arrow is for line J, which is the line for federal funds requested now. Both of these, both the column and the line, need to be completed at all fiscal reports. These two lines actually allow me to get an understanding of how much money you're requesting for the next month. In order for me to vouch your funds, both the column and the line need to be completed. And like I said too, some counties only provide or only work on a reimbursement schedule, and others ask for a cash advance. So this I'll be able to look at and get a feeling for whether you're asking for funds in advance or just trying to recoup the funds that you have expended in the past month. Also on this form, it has a line that you need to insert the amount of funds that you have received thus far. This is typically an amount that you're going to have to work closely with your fiscal person or your county auditor to see how much you've received so far from ICEJ or the state. This amount will also come into play to show your cash balance, which is on the line directly below. And then the cash balance, you should also take this into consideration when you're requesting funds. On the very bottom of the page for the fiscal report form is where you're going to have the two signatures, one for the person who prepared the report, and the second one would be for the person who is approving your work. Fund disbursement. The most important thing to note is that it is the site's responsibility to A, have a separate account for the ARI funds, or B, to have a clear method of accounting or separation of ARI dollars from other funds. For payments to subcontractors, it is truly up to the site how they would like to operate. It is strongly suggested that for the subcontractors, you only make payments to subcontractors or vendors upon them providing you with an invoice or some kind of a billing statement, and provide them payment on a reimbursement process. At the very end of the grant period, it's a lot easier to pay out money owed to subcontractors rather than try to recoup overpayment to subcontractors. And as a side note, it's a very quick turnaround process for once your grant closes out, and say you have received a surplus of funds from ICEJ, those funds have to be returned to the state within 45 days. So I strongly suggest that you only pay your subcontractors on a reimbursement basis. And once again, the fund disbursement, the first available time to request funds will be at your initial cash request. Like I said, that's really up to each individual site as to how much they would like to request the first time.
All right, this is Lindsay again. I'm going to touch real briefly on site visits just to give you all a heads up that this is something that we do. So the purpose and expectations of ARI site visits. The point is to review site progress toward program goals in the ARI plan and growth since the program's inception. Site visits identify areas where technical assistance may be needed, and they're used to share successes, challenges, and innovations with the site visit team and the ARI Oversight Board. We've found that site visits are an invaluable tool to share information around the state about what programs are doing. And at the close of a site visit, the team will receive a report written up by ARI staff on the strengths of the program and areas for improvement and some resources for improvement. So to give you an idea of the stakeholders involved, the ARI site visit team usually consists of myself, the ARI program manager, the director, Marianne Dyer, one or both of two retired judges that we work with, and it'll sometimes include the grant monitor as well. Ideally, the stakeholders at the local level include the entire ARI team. So that might include a judge, probation officers, probation director, the treatment provider representatives, and we always do our best to meet with participants, current participants, or graduates of the program. Site visits consist of participation in team meetings, observation of court calls, if that's applicable, visits to the contracting treatment providers, and then, as I mentioned, conversations with current participants or graduates. When site visits happen, a main contact at the site is identified to work with myself, Lindsay, to set up the visit, and we work on the agenda together and share in advance so everyone knows what is going to occur. So that's what a programmatic site visit looks like, and Cindy's going to talk a little bit about the grant monitoring component of a site visit, which may or may not exist at the same site visit.
So like Lindsay had just said, there'll be site visits where I will be attending along with the ARI program staff, or there could be a site visit where it'll just be myself. The purpose of the ICEJA Grant Monitor site visit is to focus mainly on the administrative organization of the program and to monitor compliance with agreement. This is not going to be any kind of a surprise visit. I'm not just going to pop in. It's actually, you're going to receive an agenda, a formal notification of my visit, and also you'll be given advance notice of what documentation I'll be looking for and what documentation to have on hand. During my visit, I would like to have staff introductions with ARI program staff, tour the facility. If you've purchased any equipment, I will be looking to see if that's on site. And also, like I said, review of documentation, such as making sure you have an exam or have the signed contract on site, any fiscal reports that you've provided, timesheets, data collection, and really making sure that everything is on hand, accessible, and organized. In terms of frequency for site visits, all new sites will have a grant monitor site visit within their first program period. So before the end of June 30th, I will be coming out to each of your sites. Following your first performance period, you will have a site visit at minimum every 2 years. And like I said, everything will be explained, what to expect, and at my time, or at what time I will be coming and what date. So it's really not going to be anything shocking to you. Lastly, when I'm there, I'll also be able to provide any technical assistance, answer any questions. If you're having any issues with forms, or if I can help you with a budget revision, I'll be there to do that as well.
All right, we're nearing the end of the webinar, so I'm going to touch on data reporting. So data reporting is done quarterly. Quarterly data reports are due to the grant monitor 2 weeks after the quarter closes. So for a full 12-month grant, they're due October 15th, January 15th, April 15th, and July 15th. For the new ARI grantees that are running on 6-month grants, the first report will be due April 15th, and you'll have the one due April 15th and then another one due July 15th. So who are the responsible parties? In general, it's a representative from the program agency who's going to submit the quarterly data report to the grant monitor, and that's something that's certainly shared with ARI staff, which is myself and Marianne Dyer. Anyone within the program can submit the quarterly data report. They just have to have access to the information needed, and that gets into the nitty-gritty of the number of individuals screened for the program, the number enrolled, the number of individuals who are accessing treatment in the past quarter, and some qualitative information such as the program's plans for the next quarter. So what's the purpose and importance of these quarterly data reports? They're actually a requirement of all grants at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. They're a valuable tool for a snapshot of what's going on in the program in the past quarter, and it's a venue where the program can communicate successes and any issues that have arisen. The reports provide an ability to provide qualitative information rather than the quantitative information that's provided in something we call quarterly data pulls, which I'll touch on in a minute. The quarterly data report information is self-reported, although you should be and can obtain some of that information from the ARI database when that's possible. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and talk about a little more detail. And I'll just note that, as you probably realized, any site that conducted a planning grant, you're a little familiar with these quarterly data reports because even planning grantees have to submit them. So common mistakes on the quarterly data report. And these are some of the measures that we ask for. This is about as quantitative as it gets. So number of clients served is all clients active at any point during the quarter. So even if you have a client that was committed to the Department of Corrections during that quarter, if they were active at any point during that quarter, you would list them here. The number referred or screened for program eligibility during the quarter, the number newly enrolled during the quarter, and that refers to the number of individuals that were officially enrolled into the program. So on the last day of the quarter, if somebody was just in the pipeline and they weren't officially in yet, they wouldn't be counted. We would expect them to show up in the next quarterly data report. The number of individuals exiting this quarter, and that might be exiting successful, exiting unsuccessful, or other exit. And a quote-unquote other exit varies, but just as an example, this might be somebody who transferred to a different diversion program. Maybe some mental health symptoms were recognized and they were screened in a mental health court, so they transferred from an intensive probation supervision with services program to a mental health court. So that's not a successful exit, it's not an unsuccessful exit from the ARI program, it's an other exit. And then finally, of the unsuccessful exits, how many were committed to the Illinois Department of Corrections? So using the data pull information for the quarterly data report. The quarterly data reports that I was just talking about are not as nuanced as the quarterly data pull. However, it does touch on substance abuse treatment access, mental health treatment access, and cognitive behavioral therapy treatment access. Tomorrow's webinar is going to get into the nitty-gritty of the quarterly data pulls and the ARI database. So tomorrow you're going to learn about how that system can assist with completing these quarterly data reports. I guess the final thing I'll say on the difference between the quarterly data reports and the quarterly data pull is the data reports are a requirement of all CJA grants. They get at some qualitative measures that there's not another mechanism for sharing. And the quarterly data pulls touches on more nuanced information that some of that nuanced information is required by the Crime Reduction Act of 2009, which is the legislation that created Adult Redeploy Illinois. And when you sign your Exhibit A, that's a part of your grant agreement, you're agreeing to report on all these data elements. So you have a lot to learn tomorrow, and Marianne Dyer and Rebecca Skorick are going to present that webinar tomorrow.
So I guess at this time we can open up the floor. If anyone has any questions, you can type it up in the chat message box, or if you would prefer to email either one of us or call us, here is actually our contact information if you don't already have it.
So Cindy and I will hang out here for a few minutes, see if any questions pop up. But for those of you that have to sign off, we sincerely appreciate you taking the time to participate in this webinar, and we think and we hope that it will make things easier for everyone in the near future. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we do have a question about food and drink purchases. We have given Subway cards as incentives. Yes, Subway cards or restaurant cards, those are fine as incentives as long as in your budget it specifically states incentive for participants. Examples such as, Subway cards. If it's very specific in your budget, that is fine. And this is something that your grant monitor or fiscal or legal would have caught. So if it's actually in your agreement now, I'm almost positive that it's completely acceptable the way that it's written. The other question, will there be a template for both data reports? There is a template for the data report that we covered in this webinar. You will receive that as well as the fiscal report template with your grant agreement packet. And for both of those, in addition to this webinar, you're going to have detailed instructions for completion. Susie also asked the question, for the monthly fiscal reports, will there be detailed instructions? Yes. Once you receive the fiscal report template, there are very, very detailed instructions that will walk you through exactly how to complete it. And as always, if you ever have any questions, you can contact one of the ARI staffs and they will help you.
Well, it looks like there's no more questions, so Cindy and I are going to sign off. And again, we appreciate all your participation today, and we hope to hear from you tomorrow during the second webinar on data, which will be from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m.
Okay, all done. Everyone's signing out.